Animorphs didn't make me a cockroach. Not a single one of the Earthsea books made me a wizard, because reading books about things doesn't turn you into those things. But Congress thinks you're too stupid to know that. Is why they introduced HR 7661. It looks like it's going to the full US House for a vote. What's the bill? Specifically seeking to create a nationwide book ban against any and all books featuring what they're calling gender dysphoria or transgenderism. But what's worse, they have this extremely vague language in the bill that says that it prohibits any sexually oriented material and then doesn't define it.
Let's talk about free speech, book bans, and America's centuries-old purity problem. Because the phrase sexually oriented material is almost always a dog whistle to homophobes and transphobes. Welcome back to Yesterqueers. My name's Amanda, and I'm a public historian of queer history. In spite of the First Amendment, there is absolutely no legal tradition of unfettered free speech in the United States. Ours is a history of control and censorship, starting with the Sedition Act of 1798, which made writing, printing, publishing, or even saying anything scandalous and malicious about the government a crime. From there, we moved on to state speech bans and a gag rule in the U.S. House to suppress anti-slavery speech. We passed the Comstock Act in 1873, more on that in a second. We had another Sedition Act in 1918 that resulted in more than 1,000 people being convicted on speech-related offenses. The Smith Act in 1940, followed by McCarthyism and the Lavender Scare. You get the picture. And yet, even with our expansive history of censorship, we have never had a nationwide book ban, so this is a big deal. The people who want this bill to pass think that Disney's Snow White is a wholesome fairy tale and Daniel Hack's Prince and Knight is lewd and lascivious material. And they think that because the core belief underpinning this legislation is that trans people specifically and queer people broadly are sexually perverse, that our very existence is obscene. An idea that goes all the way back to the Puritans, whose rigid views on piety and morality shaped the foundations of what is now the United States. I've talked before about how queer people, especially queer men, were stereotyped as child predators and villainized in the US after World War II, but of course it goes back further than that. Puritan patriarch Cotton Mather wrote about the pollution of homosexuality and the danger that it posed to children more than once. And in the wake of the Civil War, US Postal Inspector and anti-vice activist Anthony Comstock included veiled references to homosexuality in his book, Traps for the Young. Yes, Anthony Comstock is the man for whom the Comstock Act is named. You probably first heard about it when Roe v. Wade was overturned, because the Comstock Act is still on the books, and it criminalizes using the U.S. Postal Service to distribute obscenity, which includes contraceptives, medications that could end pregnancies or treat STIs, adult toys, and personal letters with sexually explicit content. It also criminalizes even mentioning any of those things via mail. As you might imagine, the Comstock Act and the state and local laws inspired by it has done a lot of heavy lifting when it comes to harassing and silencing queer people, because obscenity is not protected by the First Amendment, but it also doesn't have a specific legal definition. For the first 80 years that the Comstock Act and similar laws were on the books, obscenity was quite literally defined by vibes. If a local censorship board or the police or a judge said something was obscene, then it was. In 1957, the ruling in Roth v. U.S. led the Supreme Court to start defining obscene material as that which is patently offensive and utterly without redeeming social value. And since 1973, the Supreme Court has been using something called the Miller test. In order to be considered obscene, a work must meet all three of the following criteria. The average person applying contemporary community standards would find that the work appeals to the prurient interest. The work depicts or describes sexual contact or excretory functions in a patently offensive way. The work, taken as a whole, lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. Clear as mud, right? In a 1992 article for The New Republic, Kathleen M. Sullivan summed it up when she said, "The first two parts of the test are incoherent. They require the audience to be turned on and grossed out at the same time. Few judges and juries like to admit personally to being in such a double state." Justice Douglas, who wrote the dissenting opinion in Miller, expressed concerns that the test would actually make it easier to suppress speech. But as far as legal definitions go, this is the best we have. And this is the precedent that the Supreme Court will be using to evaluate the cases that will inevitably end up in front of them if this book ban passes. So whose community standards are we talking about? Who gets to decide that two male characters kissing counts as sexual contact, or that a trans character only appeals to the prurient interest? Which community standards have jurisdiction for a book that is written in Illinois, printed in New York, added to a school library in Kansas, and read online in Florida? I don't have answers to these questions, but I do know that this proposed book ban is just one of the ways in which Christian nationalists are trying to erase queer people from this country's past, present, and future. So call your reps. Tell them to vote no on HR 7661. And then go buy some queer books or ask your local library to buy some. I've got a ton of recommendations if you need a place to start. That's it for today. As always, more information, including sources and further reading, is available in the usual place.